How do you think it affects people's lives here in America?
Well, we are contributing to it, many of us who are into materialism and consumerism, but it also affects jobs, I'm sure, because many corporations are going overseas to get the cheap labor.
What do you think a restructuring of the WTO would look like to be more effective and fair to
I don't know if there's any restructuring possible. I'd like to see it totally eliminated and begin to operate in a way that permits everybody in the world to have enough, rather than just affluent countries like ours that get so doggone much excess in materials.
What do you think the best outcome would be from all these protests going on here?
Well, I'm not particularly optimistic, but I'm hopeful. I've got my fingers crossed.
Thank you.
Okay.
Well, given the fact that that they have at this point no agenda whatsoever, that their agenda has completely fallen apart, I think the best action would be if on the 30th we can manage to shut them down enough, and actually throughout the week, the 30th especially, but throughout the week, we can manage to shut them down enough to make it possible for them not to be able to arrive at a ministerial agreement, for them to come Thursday, have their big press conference, and have absolutely nothing to show for it. I think that would be the most ideal situation I can come up with. I don't think that it's realistic to think that the WTO is going to go away from one week of protesting, but I think it is possible that we could make it so that they have nothing to show for their week of negotiations.
So if you were to propose an alternative to the WTO, what would that look like?
An alternative to the WTO, there's a couple steps that need to be taken, I think. The first one would be to pass massive and comprehensive campaign finance reform to make it to where, say, nobody can contribute more than $100 to any campaign. Then the next thing would be to support independent media and support public access television in such a way that all candidates get free airtime on both public access and on network television, so that there are no more commercials. Like campaign ads would just be banned, and the only thing that could happen is that each candidate who wanted to campaign for office would be given a certain number of hours of campaign time that they could use on the air, and that would have to be used for actual discussions with people and debates and such things like that. So I think that would be the first step, and following that would have to be a complete reform of corporations as we know it. Basically, the Santa Clara County decision in 1886, which gave corporations the rights of human beings, would have to be overturned, or legislation would have to be passed stating implicitly that corporations do not have the same rights as human beings, and that they are in fact a fiction of paper.
Cool. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Well, the WTO brought me here, and I'm really excited about the solidarity and the actions going on, and I think it's really a really important thing, because there's just so many people from different groups and different interests, but it's all so many people against it, and there's not really one specific thing that I'm here for. It's sort of all of it. It's sort of democracy and letting people have their voice.
So, after it's all said and done, what do you think would be successful in our efforts here?
Let's see. I don't really know what could happen with the WTO itself. I think what I'm thinking about most is educating the world about it and making our voices heard, and helping open it up and helping people rise up and seeing what's going on, because it's been such a hidden thing behind closed doors, and hopefully people will wake up and listen and try to find out about it.
So if you were to propose an alternative to the whole thing, what would that look like?
Wow. Well, I don't know if it's possible to have an organization that would really be an alternative, but the alternatives to having this organization, I think, are having things more locally more local trade, local currency programs, things growing from grassroots, from the ground up. Like, you know, there's CSAs. Helena Norberg-Hatch mentions community-supported agriculture, and I think it's really important for people to feel more connected to the things around them, and with trade, they'll feel more accountable, responsible to the people around them, and feel more of a community. And I think someone said in one of the teach-ins that it's important to trade what you can as much as you can locally, and then more regionally, and then you trade internationally, but not the way that it's being done right now. My name's Kim Allen.
That's what I
From Baltimore, Maryland.
The WTO is affecting people in first world countries. People in first world countries by the WTO. Do you want to participate in this?
Go ahead.
I've just been actually flattering, so I'm not on wavelength yet. But first world countries are affected in two big ways. The first two things that I think of are environmental issues, our water, our air. The Clean Air Act, of course, is a prime example of that. And that's something that affects us here in the U.S. Also, of course, by lowering wages overseas and continuing this race to the bottom, corporations in the U.S. and workers in the U.S. are forced to compete with that over the seas. So here in the U.S., corporations are saying to their workforces, here you've got to compete with this other labor overseas now, and that's another big part of it from where I'm coming from.
So if you want to restructure the WTO,
restructuring the WTO to make it good for people would require people's input into the World Trade Organization. Right now, there's absolutely none of that. The people's interests are not being represented in as much as I am aware. There has to be some implementation of the democratic process to go into that. If the people's voices are to be heard, if there's going to be any self-determination with the WTO as a tool for that, everyone has to be included. Another thing that's a problem with the WTO, of course, is transparency, because up until now, and even now, most of the things that happen in the World Trade Organization happen behind closed doors. And if the public's going to have a voice, it also needs to be informed. Things need to be brought out in the public light. Tertiary. Accountability is big as well, because even if people have an information base on which to base their decisions, and even if there is democracy in the World Trade Organization, accountability, I guess, kind of goes along with that democracy. So officials in the World Trade Organization, the trade delegates themselves, I feel, need to be publicly accountable. They need to face public opinion. They need to be responsible to the public. And I think if those three things are incorporated into the World Trade Organization to some extent, it can be improved and more responsive to the public, and therefore more in tune with public opinion and lending itself to the public good.
so what do you think the actions here in Seattle this week, what would make it successful? What would success look like for the actions here?
The important thing, as I see it, for the actions to accomplish, is to bring media into it, to get the fact that there is an opposition out into the public eye, because up until now, what the public is hearing about the World Trade Organization is only the silver lining, or some people's interpretation of what the World Trade Organization's possibilities are in terms of a glorious idea of free trade. And by so many people coming to Seattle and by gaining media coverage, I hope that people on the outside will get another opportunity to look at the situation, a situation which affects them, and get the idea that maybe there is something here to look more closely at. There's something that they might want to question. And at the same time, as well as getting that media attention, It's also a question of getting the attention of the World Trade Organization itself, so they can see that even in the U.S. there's opposition to their ideas, and that we will organize to fight what they're representing.
Could you say your name and where you're from?
I'm Evan Firestone. I'm a student at the University of Oregon.
Thank you.
All right, thank you.
So, how does the WTO affect people here in America and in first world countries?
Oh, in America, the WTO? Well, that's a big one. Because basically they make the laws that can supersede, like environmental laws and stuff like that. So it's the trade. It's our what do you call it? The high-level trade agreements that all the countries make together are done by the WTO. So it affects us because I think it does things like when they say promote free trade and then they start doing manufacturing in another country, then the jobs here go over there. And that's okay because, I think America is capable of creating more jobs and doing service. But the problem that I see that goes with it is that those other countries don't necessarily have to do the environmental laws or even have the labor laws that we have. So people over there can work for less money. And in fact, to the point that that's where you get the sweatshops, and there's no rule that says they have to do that, or there's no rule that says that they have to follow the same environmental regulations that we do. So when you see jobs going away because of things like cheaper labor or less environmental regulations, that's scary because even if they screw up the environment over there, it's going to screw up our environment too. So yeah, it affects us.
I'm finding that people are traveling.
Well, there's also the issue of preempting our own national laws, like the Endangered Species Act and the Clean Air Act.
Right, and we've made those laws on purpose. We've made laws to protect, like in Washington where we do logging, there's all kinds of laws to kind of to make it so that they're not cutting old growth forests and to kind of try and regulate how much they're cutting when and how they do it, keeping some of the jobs here as well. And then when they go say free trade, you can export all the logs you want. That encourages, one, it changes the prices, and two, it encourages more old growth lumber to get cut, and it encourages things that I wouldn't particularly want to encourage. Now, it's not that I think that you shouldn't have trade, but I think that you have to look at it and say, what are the effects of it? What are the effects on the local economies? So, in Washington, for example, the trade on, which is a big trade state, you trade on logs, and it does a huge thing with the local economy.
So if you were to restructure the WTO, what would that look like?
I'm not an expert on that one at all. I work at, and our fearless leader is David Corton, who's written all these things about it. But I think, a big one is to make sure that how they actually make these decisions is done in a public fashion, so people can actually see what's happening, and that when they do have, that they keep environmental and labor laws and the other kind of the local regulations in mind, that they're not superseding them.
Well, if they would make the standards higher instead of lowering the standards, like in the case of the Clean Air Act, because some of the countries couldn't meet the standard, the clean air standard for gasoline. They ended up lowering it because they said that if we were to impose the U.S. standard, that would be constituting a trade barrier to that country because their laws were lower. But that ends up lowering all ships instead of raising everyone else to meet it. And we're at the point where if we have a global economy, I think you've got to think about the global ecology too, because if you start dirtying the air all over the planet, we do have global problems like the greenhouse effect, which affects everyone. So if you no longer think about the atmosphere as being just above one country or another, but something that it's an atmosphere that circles the globe.
And then when I look at it, it's like the biotech stuff, where you say, oh, you in Europe, you have to take out bioengineered products. Well, why is that? The WTO's right to tell them that they have to supersede their local laws about how things are bioengineered or what kinds of products they're allowed to have, imported. That doesn't make sense.
That's fine.
So the labeling thing. So, to restructure it would be to say, make it public, make it more evenly, that they're listening to not just against the corporations, so that they're not saying, oh, the best thing, the reason we have the WTO is to increase profits. I mean, is that what you want? I mean, so the companies say, of course we want to increase profits, but then you look at what cost. You're increasing profits at the cost, short-term profits, at the cost of long-term environmental, thing, or the cost of regional economies and local people being able to keep their jobs. I was listening to Vandana Shiva last night, and she was saying for every additional dollar of trade with India, they lose $10 in local economy. I mean, like, wait a minute, you can't say that those people want more trade.
Yeah.
No, I mean, that doesn't make any sense. And so in the U.S., I think, like even the city of Seattle, they passed this anti-MAI ordinance. So they didn't want, the multilateral agreement on investments. But then the WTO can come along and say, oh yes, we support the MAI, and what's the city of Seattle, or local areas? They don't have a choice then. No, it's not fair that those laws can be more important than the local laws, which were made, like you said, made for a reason.
So that's a regular job?
I mean, in the case of the Endangered Species Act, there were reasons the Endangered Species Act was put into place, saying that if you're fishing for shrimp, you have nets that do not let turtles in. Well, because it ended up being cost inefficient, they decided they didn't want to go along with that standard. I'm not saying I'm an advocate for the standard, but that's saying that a body larger than a national government, which spent a lot of time. I mean, it took 25 years to get the Endangered Species Act. I mean, it's been 25 years that the Endangered Species Act has been in place. It took a lot of work to keep it in place. Suddenly, a trade group can decide that they want to override that. That's a question. And yet, I think one thing people are realizing is that these things are happening without them even knowing they're happening. In the case of genetically modified foods, whatever you may think, I mean, you may want to eat a genetically modified chicken, but if it's labeled, then you can have that pleasure. Then you can know that you're eating a genetically modified chicken. But there are people who may not want to, may want to, and So
I was thinking there was another one that I was reading about, which was where when something actually does go to challenge one of the rules that the WTO, the people who decide whether the challenge is valid or not is a tribunal of 3 people. And who do you know who those 3 people are? And they don't even have to excuse themselves because of conflict of interest or anything. And that the 3 people that they're choosing, and then they look at who they're getting as advisors, tends to be the people who are again going after the global corporations. The people who are saying, oh, well, this is going to hurt a global corporation, so this must be bad. So, okay, I guess, we better, rule in favor of the global corporation one. And that doesn't make any sense. So, you're smiling.
Oh, I was just watching the interview to see what's happening. That's all.
One last question.
Sure.
What do you think the outcomes of the actions here in Seattle this week will be?
Well, it's already had some outcomes, because I heard Clinton the other day say, of course we have to take environmental and labor laws into account when we make WTO things. And it's like they weren't saying anything like that a couple months ago, okay? So now that's not enough, but at least they're starting to say that. So I mean, you're saying the outcome is, 1, it'll get more visibility. 2, it's like, wait a minute, the citizens do care, hello, so that's going to be an outcome, and hopefully, I hope that they start taking steps to restructure how it works.
Permanent part-time.